We're going to take you live to Queen's Park now for a briefing on the province's plan to relocate the Science Centre to Ontario Place. Let's listen in.
Case and to answer any questions that you might have. Before getting to highlights, if you'll permit me, I just want to express my pride in the professionals of the collective Team Ontario that work very hard on the product that you have access to. In particular, I want to call out the hardworking people at Infrastructure Ontario who have been studying the question of the condition and the location of the Ontario Science Centre dating back at least a dozen years now. All of the thoughtful analysis that you see within the business case is a reflection of their very hard work, and I'm very fortunate to just be their spokesperson here today. In short, the business case, which you've seen, identifies clear benefits to relocating the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place. It shows that if relocated, costs incurred by the Ontario taxpayer will be approximately $257 million less over a 50-year period when compared to remaining at Don Mills. That number is $596 million if inflation is factored in. Relocation also allows for the creation of a high-efficiency, state-of-the-art facility for future generations of Ontario with significantly more permanent exhibition space than the present facility at Don Mills. Before I get into some of the details of those conclusions, I think it probably actually makes sense to contextualize the business case that we've released by telling you about the long record of government analysis about the condition of the Science Centre. I'm very happy to say that IO and the Ontario Science Centre have a long and very close working relationship. IO and its predecessor agency have managed the current Ontario Science Centre at the Don Mills site for decades on behalf of the province. In addition to daily maintenance, IO and its contracted service provider have worked tirelessly with the OSC staff to identify necessary repairs and maintenance that are required to continue the centre's educational science programming. As a part of that work, IO regularly conducts assessments of the facility's overall condition to identify necessary building repairs and upgrades. Over the past 2 decades, I don't think it'll surprise you to know that IO has noted an increasing capital deficit that occurs when an aged facility defers necessary but non-critical repairs and upgrades due to limited funding that's available for repair. I want to stress that during this time, the government has invested millions of dollars in critical maintenance projects at the OSC in order to keep it operational and, above all else, to keep it safe. And we have executed a recurring plan of invasive testing to understand the actual condition of various elements of the Science Centre. It was precisely this kind of planned intrusive testing that revealed the urgent need to address structural issues with the Science Centre's bridge last year. We commissioned a third-party report from Pynchon Limited in April 2022, which confirmed with further precision that a minimum capital investment of at least $478 million would be required to restore the building to a passable condition for the long term. It's worth noting that that figure contains approximately $109 million in exhibit upgrades and cosmetic improvements, but the vast majority of that investment is about addressing critical and deferred maintenance. Those exhibit upgrades and cosmetic improvements were identified in partnership through multiple workshops with the Ontario Science Centre, but it's worth noting that it is impossible to expand the present Science Centre at Don Mills to get more permanent exhibition space without major interior renovations, which are not anticipated in the costs that I've just rehearsed to you. In short, no matter what money we spend on updating the existing OSC site, it will always be less efficient, oversized for its current needs, and be more expensive to operate and maintain. I think there are other factors that lead us to conclude that the projected cost to remain at Don Mills is subject to further contingency and escalations. Again, as builders of things, we fully expect that additional issues might be identified, found conditions discovered, as we began any reconstruction project for an aged heritage facility once more in-depth testing began, which could lead to cost escalation, reliably does lead to cost escalation when you think about major works that are underway right now, like the rehabilitation of Centre Block in Ottawa and even our own McDonald Block here in Toronto. For precision, the estimate that we have in the business case includes a contingency for unforeseen costs that ranges between 15% and 30%. it is absolutely accurate to say that there are multiple instances of found condition requiring a contingency in respect of costs well in excess of 40%. So I think the message that I'm conveying to you is the contingency that we factored in for found conditions is a very conservative assumption in the business case. I would note also that the business case presumes a closure of the entire facility to accomplish the remediation and the fixes that are intended. That closure is estimated to be at 1 year in the business case. It is equally true to say that it is possible for that duration of the closure of the facility to be much, much longer, 3 years or more, given the sheer scope of the repairs that are required and the unpredictability that I've already referenced about the conditions that will be found. Obviously, that would have not only material impact, on the cost to remain, but also have a real operational discontinuity for the Ontario Science Centre. Given that analysis that we had done about the present facility, the government then asked us in 2022 to prepare a business case, which we're releasing today, which evaluates two options for the modernization of the Ontario Science Centre. First, to relocate to Ontario Place in a new, smaller, more efficient facility with new exhibits and modernized program. Or two, to remain at the current site and address capital repairs and deferred maintenance issues and to refresh cosmetically public areas and exhibits at the current site. I think it's worth noting that this is not the first time that Infrastructure Ontario has been asked to analyze precisely this question. Relocating the Ontario Science Centre to a new facility, and indeed relocating it to Ontario Place, has been considered by various governments dating back to before Ontario Place was closed in 2012. Infrastructure Ontario was first engaged actually in 2016 by the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport to conduct an analysis for relocating the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place, and a draft analysis was completed in August of 2016. That review reached a very similar conclusion, that there were several benefits, including cost savings, that would accrue to the building of a new OSC facility. That business case pointed at many of the same factors as the updated business case that we're releasing today, including shrinking attendance, mounting critical building maintenance costs, age of the facility, declining revenues, and stagnant operating subsidies, all of which clearly suggested that the OSC at Don Mills was not sustainable under status quo assumptions. All of those previous studies that we've done, and indeed studies related to the Ontario Science Centre dating back well before 2009, were incorporated in the business case that we're releasing today. And I would note that all of these previous studies also emphasize that relocation could actually address two government priorities through a single infrastructure investment. One, ensuring the long-term viability of the OSC. Second, establishing an anchor for culture and innovation at Ontario Place. So, as Alan has already told you, we did this with partners. And maybe just to briefly rehearse what each of our partners brought to the table, I'm joined today by Ed and Dov. Ed from Ernst & Young. His team was enlisted to make sure that our business case was fulsome and that the best practices associated with generating a business case were ultimately put into practice in connection to this one. They also provided analysis related to the economic impact of both options for us. Dov is from Lord Cultural Resources, who have a long history of advising government on both the future of Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre, including previous business cases for relocation. Dov and his team were a real force in bringing some of the best practices to bear that they have observed from other similar sorts of organizations across North America that they've also advised, and were a big part of the 20-plus workshops that we had with the Ontario Science Centre and team to think about not only the functional program of a new science centre, high-level design, but also inputs to the business case. I want to offer my sincere thanks to Paul and the entire team at the OSC. As I said, this was a significant investment of time and expertise from them as we tried to bring this independent and fact-based analysis to government for its consideration. So again, I definitely want to get to questions. Let me just rehearse for you one more time what I think the three key findings of the business case are. First, total capital investment required to remain at Don Mills exceeds the cost of constructing a new OSC facility at Ontario Place. As you'll see in the business case, the new facility is estimated to have a design and construction cost of $387 million, inclusive of new exhibits, even including one-time moving costs for the relocation, which are estimated at roughly $40 million. The total capital investment required is less than the Remain option, which, as I've said, is still subject to all the caveats associated with possible escalation of those costs. Number two, relocating the OSC to Ontario Place will save the government $257 million in net present value, $596 million when inflation is factored in over a 50-year period, while delivering and maintaining a high-efficiency, state-of-the-art science facility for future generations of Ontarians. And three, the relocation of the OSC, its modernization can be a single capital investment that benefits two government priorities: the viability for the long term of the Ontario Science Centre and expediting the redevelopment of Ontario Place by delivering an anchor tenant to occupy, amongst other things, the vacant pods and Cinesphere which are being rehabilitated, and ultimately to make Ontario a family-friendly destination. So my thanks again for your attention. I appreciate your questions in advance, and I'm happy to take them.
$257 million in savings over 50 years. How much of that is due to the new science center being about half the size of the current building?
A considerable amount of it. Dov, maybe you could come in here and just talk about relative size of various science centers and how they compare in respect of ongoing costs.
So we looked at a number of science centers in the last that have been built and planned over the last 10, 15 years. In Miami, in San Francisco, some relocated, some new builds, and they're in the range of about smaller, 230,000 to 280,000 square feet gross area. That's including exhibition space. So when we looked at that and see the size of the Ontario Science Centre, they're significantly, bigger, mostly in ancillary spaces that are unused. So the newer science centers that are built around the world, mostly in North America, smaller, more compact, more efficient, but maintaining, large gallery spaces, which are the most important component of any science center. It's important to note too that you want to make a distinction between a science center and a science museum. Science museums are larger because they have collections. There are fewer of them. This is a science center, which there are some 500 of them around the world, and they're in that range of about 230 to 280,000 square feet.
And I would add, I think one of the big changes here is that there's an increase in the permanent exhibit space in an even smaller science center, 110,000 square feet for permanent exhibits versus 100,000 in the present facility.
Which is important. That's the reason why people go to the science centers for the exhibitions.
Can you give an update on the bridge? The business case, I think, mentions that a preliminary estimate showed it would be about $16 million to fix it, which is not a whole heck of a lot of money for a government of this size. What's happening with the bridge? Why has it not been repaired yet?
We're in the process right now of agreeing what the repair plan is going to be for the bridge. Tony, I wondered if you had any comment on this?
Yeah, no, I think Michael, you're bang on. So part of the ongoing process is to take a look at the cost of what it would be to bring to full use, take a look at the operations of it and the ongoing viability. So working with our construction and third-party advisors, we still haven't gotten to that final costing, and our goal is to get the RFP out if needed, to get the bridge done if needed. But also, in April of 23, there was a desire, a wish, a work on the Science Centre now moving to the Ontario Place. So from a business case perspective, all of those costs were put in. That was the minimum cost that we knew at that time. And we're still working to see what the ongoing cost is, which would, again, affect to the greater, I would believe, deferred maintenance pool. Only making the business case better.
Yeah, as an opportunity to salute the work of the Ontario Science Centre again, right? I mean, literally a call, right, from Pynchon on Bluebird Tuesday, I think it was, to tell us that the intrusive testing that we had long planned had revealed some structural concerns, and what the team was able to do there to rapidly change the nature of their operational profile in order to make sure that nobody was on that bridge was amazingly impressive. I think it occurred over the course of a weekend. Those types of revealed issues, when you do intrusive testing, is precisely what I'm pointing at in respect of what we just simply don't know about as we rehabilitate the existing facility might be found to be true.
Sorry, just to clarify, you are fixing the bridge, or you're not sure yet?
We're in the process of examining exactly what is needed to get the bridge in full operation so that the operations of the Science Centre, if they're going to continue to use the bridge, would be there. So we don't have that final answer yet, and we don't have the final costing.
So you might still fix it even though you plan on closing it down?
That's part of the discussion.
I think. Or I just want to ask about the giant golf ball and the pods at Ontario Place. You mentioned there's a cost escalator built in to the existing science center's estimates on repairs, but those buildings are also in rough shape, I understand. Did you factor in the cost of restoring those as well in the cost of the new
Yes,
building?
sir. Being covered elsewhere, right? Work is already underway. Part of the landlord investments that are being made at Ontario Place to make sure that that's a platform as the island to animate the vision that we ultimately want to bring to realization.
So that cost is not included in your estimate of the cost of the new science center?
That's correct. It's covered separately under a tender associated
pods.
with site rehabilitation and the remediation and restoration of the pods in the Cinesphere.
Do we have a rough estimate on what the science center portion of that money that we're putting in would be?
Well, it's independent. The two things are separate and distinct. One is the bucket of money that's being expended by the Government of Ontario in order to bring Ontario Place itself to an appropriate state of rehabilitation in order to have tenants at it. The rehabilitation, the repair of the heritage pods and Cinesphere is part of that budget, not part of the Science Centre budget at all.
I'm paying for both of them as a taxpayer in Ontario, and so shouldn't the math include for the cost of the new Science Centre, the cost of the refurb of these aging structures that are suspended over Lake Ontario and are probably very expensive to fix up? Shouldn't that also be part of the calculation? To figure, if I'm trying to figure out whether it makes sense to move this Science Centre or not, shouldn't that be part of the mix?
Fair. Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think independently, it is true to say that taxpayers are making an investment in rehabilitating Ontario Place in order to animate not only the Ontario Science Centre, but all of the tenants consistent with the vision that the government has announced. And I think those investments are required in order to take an island that has sat fallow for close to 12 years and to turn it into a place that resembles what we all remember it being, which is a place for entertainment and a destination to really go to. So I don't dispute the point. I think I'm only saying that the two budgets, in the way that we compute them, are separate, and that you're not seeing details of that in the business case that we've released today.
What's confusing is the government's now, just the other day, suggested they're going to keep the existing Science Centre building, which I think also has some heritage designation. There are people who would say it should remain. But, of course, we're removing its admittedly declining source of revenue if we move it to Ontario Place. How does that factor in? Will the taxpayer be on the hook for maintaining and fixing up this building that no longer has a defined tenant anymore?
Yeah, here's what I have to say about that. I don't have a lot of information. I can just say it's clear that conversation continues as between two levels of government about the future of Don Mills and what will be located there, inclusive of science programming. So, unfortunately, I have no answers for you on that one.
Can you give us an idea of how this deferred maintenance backlog grew? Like, what exactly is being deferred, and what is the major contributors to this big deficit you're talking about, and when did they start being deferred?
Yeah, Tony, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key things that IO does is we are the asset manager for a very large portfolio of government properties across the province. And in the way that we do our asset management planning, we take a look at prioritization of all capital and all capital repairs across all of those buildings. And you can well imagine with the, over 1,200 buildings that we have across the province, we prioritize from an emergency basis first, building code, and then what we call imminent breakdowns. Within those imminent breakdowns, the life cycle of any component part within any building can span between 30 to 50 years. So part of our ongoing analysis, and I think Michael addressed it earlier, we continually do condition assessments and ongoing analysis. So we would take the dollars that are available across the entire portfolio, ensure that it's safe for every building first, and then the deferred maintenance just is part of our imminent breakdowns. It's that category 3, which an imminent breakdown can happen at any time. We're trying very hard to prioritize the ongoing operations of it. So that's how the deferred maintenance starts to grow. It's kind of like in your own home. Your roof is still good. It's probably longer than 20 years, but it hasn't critically failed. When you're starting to get into component parts that are over 30, 40, 50 years, this is why now that pension report that came out back in April started to say, you're getting your end of life here. And so does it make more sense from an end of life and a restoration to restore? Or in some cases, is it adaptive reuse or move? So that was a big component of the business case.
So you were looking at just two options, right? Stay at Don Mills or move to the Science Centre. Could there conceivably not be a third option, move the science center somewhere else in the city that saves the taxpayer even more money?
We did, in fact, or we have historically looked at multiple different possible locations for an Ontario Science Centre. It's actually a rather specialized place and location that's needed for a facility like this one. This particular analysis, this business case, was centered on the two options that we've studied. I would tell you that previous analyses that we've done about other locations, they all had their own version of material deficiencies in respect of what it was likely to do to traffic patterns, or whether we were trying to bracket a science center into a location that wasn't appropriately built for it. But the answer to the question is this business case focused on the two options.
Could you rebuild on a new center on the same site at Don Mills? A brand new facility and tear the other one down?
Well, I mean, first, tearing down the existing science center has its own considerations related to the heritage nature of that structure that would have to be factored into that. Look, we build, I think, for a living, many asset classes at Infrastructure Ontario. Always it's true to say you get more modernization, you get more efficiency, you get more bespoke, built-for-purpose assets when you create something greenfield, as opposed to demolishing or rehabilitating in place. Technically, is it possible? Yes. I would note that, that's a project that wasn't studied. We don't actually know what any of the considerations would be about Don Mills and its heritage characteristics. I would anchor on the notion that it is always, if you're trying to guarantee the viability of any operating business, whether it's a hospital, an Ontario Science Centre, or other, better to think about how you work with partners who are operators to design a newly built facility that can be modernized as opposed to trying to rehabilitate.
The existing structures at Ontario Place are a good fit for the Science Centre.
Actually, no. The opposite, I would say. The Science Centre continues to be only partially used in terms of its total square footage. It's 560,000 square feet. In fact, Dov, would you like to jump in on this one and just talk about some of the deficiencies you see?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of extraneous space that was built in 1969, wide sweeping hallways and rooms that are basically unused for the public. And so in terms of efficiency of use, in terms of a visitor experience, a good portion of it is unused.
Structure at Ontario Place is a good fit for the Science Centre.
Oh, at Ontario Place?
Yeah.
Michael, do you want to answer that?
I would say yes.
Yes, of course.
Our studies show that there is a place to put the Science Centre down at Ontario Place, and because it will be at the center of this, reimagined vision for Ontario Place with millions of visitors, will benefit from all of the possible increased traffic and visitation that goes with that. And again, I think in the business case, we've worked with the Ontario Science Centre to make assumptions about precisely the difference in attendance and foot traffic that will exist between the two facilities.
So if we're still having, if Ontario and Toronto are still having conversations about keeping some science programming at the Science Centre building in Don Mills, isn't it possible, given what you said about all the costs there, that keeping it open for some of that would eat into all the savings you're getting by moving?
Possibly. I have no details about the state of those conversations or what's intended there. I think back to the question we were asked before about the bridge, though, this would be the link that I would draw, right? We are working right now with the Ontario Science Centre to understand, given the announcement about its relocation, what has to be done to the facility in order to keep its operations safe, open, and as efficient as possible.
Building
right?
on Richard's question about potential options that you considered. In 2020, the AG studied business cases across government, and one of the things that she said was business cases often don't really present enough options. You mentioned that there are other places you have studied. You said that a new greenfield development at Don Mills wasn't. Could you just give us some information on what the other options were that were studied that weren't necessarily included in this business case?
Yeah, so again, I think to say that the options weren't included in the business case is not to say that we didn't rely upon the history of analysis that was done about the possible location of an Ontario Science Centre. There have been any number of places that we have thought about for a relocated Ontario Science Centre, whether it is public lands from the general real estate portfolio or possible locations where there was an opportunity to convert, whether it was industrial or commercial space. none of those were evaluated as being as viable as the potential to relocate the Ontario Science Centre down to Ontario Place, dating back even to 2016 during the last analysis that was done on this very question.
Do you have any specific sites that you could share with us?
I can follow up with you on that.
Yeah, and just building on the AG report thing, another thing that she said was just Treasury Board just is not given enough time to kind of evaluate these things. Oftentimes, I think she said 3 weeks is kind of like the minimum standard. Do you know how much time was given for Treasury Board to review this business case?
Well, for what it's worth, I think the Government of Ontario has been reviewing this particular question for a dozen years, so I think a lot of time has elapsed. This particular business case, though, we completed it late 2022. Right? Announcement April 2023. So based on our experience, I have no concerns that there wasn't real good and solid briefing about this particular business case.
Can you give us an idea of how the space is going to change the experience for people? What can you provide at the current site you can't provide at the new site? And what could you maybe provide at the new site that you can't provide currently at Don Mills?
Right, so some of those details probably are best directed to the Ontario Science Centre for follow-up questions. But Dov, did you want to say anything about this?
In general, I mean, you've got a clustering effect if you're down at Ontario Place. So it's not just it's the experience alone with the exhibitions and programming that happens at Ontario Science Centre, but also all the other things that are going to happen as part of an overall visit to Ontario Place. The music, also downtown, being downtown is part of a kind of a clustering of cultural and recreational events that happen in that area. So an overall impact was much greater would be at a downtown site.
Reduction force you to lose things that you currently have? Like, I get the clustering, but do you lose exhibits? Is there a scale of exhibit you can't provide, anything like that?
No.
Well, the scale of exhibits is 110,000 square feet of exhibit space versus 100,000. So it's actually a net gain.
What are the timelines here then? When is it going to close at Don Mills and when's the new one going to open? Roughly. Obviously, you need to tender out the contracts to build it.
This is it. I was going to answer the questions in reverse order. So we're working right now on details related to the procurement of a new Ontario Science Centre, still finalizing things like what contract form we're going to use, project specifications. If you've been watching Merck's tendering closely, I'm not sure anybody here would, you'll see that we're out every day, every single day, hitting refresh every 10 seconds. We've gone out to get a planning, design, and conformance advisor, essentially a technical advisor, to help us take the functional program that was designed with the Ontario Science Centre and turn it into project specifications for the procurement. There's a pipeline event that Minister Surma and I have next Monday. I advise you to watch it closely, right? Ontario, I think, does a very, very important thing, which is establish a transparency in respect of when these major procurements are likely to start. Probably have more to say about Science Centre at that time. In respect of the closure of the existing facility, that is still subject to discussion that is ongoing as between the Ontario Science Centre and government.
I'm assuming you're not going to want to keep pumping money into it if you're going to close it. So will there be a period of time where the Don Mills site is closed before the new one opens, or is the goal to keep the Don Mills one operating up until the new one opens?
We're considering multiple options, including possible interim Science Centre pop-up content, right, that travels. I think all of these things are still on the table. The thing that I feel, I use the word unambiguously, a pride about, is that all of those analyses are happening with the Ontario Science Centre as a close partner and informed by independent analysis of what the costs and benefits would be of any of that.
I really want to be clear on how this backlog happened. So you were talking about you're looking at the Infrastructure Ontario portfolio as a whole. So whatever is going on at the Ontario Science Centre has to be compared to what other repairs need to be going on at everything else you guys own. I've got that correct. Okay.
That's not a unique phenomenon to the Government of Ontario either, right?
So we've heard a lot about the government has justified a lot of closing this centre down because of the condition. So the fact that it's in a bad condition is because Infrastructure Ontario didn't prioritize the repairs there high enough.
I wouldn't say that. What I would say is we have always prioritized the critical investments that needed to be made in the Ontario Science Centre, we being IO and the Government of Ontario, in order to keep the building operational and safe.
How much money would you have needed to have done the repairs to keep to keep the Science Center in a functioning, good condition?
Well, I think this is what Tony was trying to point out before. We're now at a very different point in the life cycle of the Science Center, where it's effectively at end of life in respect of many of its systems and facilities. So the $478 million that we've worked with Pynchon to identify is at this point, given that the asset is at the end of its life, the investment that would be required to stay. I think that the thing to take away is the growth of a capital deficit in connection to a facility like this one. It does happen. Every portfolio that gets managed on a real estate basis, public or private, it occurs. I think even Tony's right. The analogy of your own house is a very, very good one. You then get to the point after 5-6 decades where no amount of investment in the critical stuff ultimately is enough to ensure the ongoing viability, because you start through invasive testing to find issues like the one that we found in connection to the bridge. So we're now at a really big inflection point in the asset management of the Ontario Science Centre, where we do have to make decisions about whether we're going to make the sizable investment to stay in that facility or begin to think about
Is there
relocating.
any direction from the government to prioritize repairs at the Science Center lower in the past 5 years?
No.
If the report was done in late 2022 and the announcement was made in April, why is it taken until November 29th to release this?
Well, I think part of the rationale was to make sure that we had done the right things from a legal and third-party perspective, to make sure that we weren't giving away confidential information. We were working closely with partners at the OSC to understand their obligations in respect of the release of this information. So this is why.
Was there any direction from government?
All right, that's the latest from Queen's Park. The Ontario government releasing its long-promised business case today for moving the Ontario Science Centre from its current East Toronto location to Ontario Place on the city's waterfront. No shortage of questions for officials there, as we were just listening to that. Infrastructure Ontario says the government can save hundreds of millions of dollars over 50 years by moving the building. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding this, and we'll continue to have reaction and details throughout the morning and afternoon.